In France, piles of shit outside the city walls grew so high that the walls had to be built up. As happened in Paris, the pile grew so big that the shit started to fall back over. And it seemed dangerous, in case an enemy got into the city by climbing the wall over the pile of excrement. The streets were drowned in mud and shit, so much so that it was impossible to walk through them in the slush. It was then, according to surviving chronicles, that stilts, the spring shoes of the citizen, appeared in many German cities, without which it was simply impossible to move through the streets. The Roman Empire had a huge influence on European civilization, but not all traditions were reflected in Europe in the Middle Ages. The Romans were very careful about the purity of their bodies. Public baths, thermae, and toilets were built in the lands of the empire. A network of complex aqueducts permeated the entire country and provided citizens with running clean water. Daily washing was compulsory for everyone. Sanitation and hygiene were strictly observed. At first, Europeans followed the canons of cleanliness invented by the Romans, but in the 15th century, with the spread of the plague and the deaths of thousands of people, there was a horror of public baths. There, people undressed, and the spreaders of the disease jumped from garment to garment, infecting everyone. People, in their ignorance, thought the plague was waterborne. The contagious plague had receded, and it would have been time to start sanitizing. But then the Protestant Church intervened and issued a dogma that naked bodies were shameful, and it was unseemly to see each other in public baths. Religious fanatics raised the cult of the human soul, and physical purity of the body was recognized as unimportant. And if the common people bathed in rivers and lakes, the nobles did not allow such liberties. Almost all baths were closed, bathing was stopped. In the 16th century, the townspeople visited baths or thermae no more than 3 times a year, and in the 17th-18th centuries, they stopped bathing altogether. The Queen of Castile was proud to have taken a bath twice in her life, and King Louis XIV remembered with horror the large amount of water in which he had to bathe. Medieval treatises on medicine also did their part. They said that water procedures weaken the body and cause disease, and layers of dirt on the body keep away from infection. Even washing the face was recognized as inappropriate. It was believed that it made the skin very sensitive to cold and heat, and that washing the face could damage the eyesight. Protestant priests imposed a ban on washing for another reason. Plain water washes off the face of the holy water with which the parishioner came into contact during the rite of baptism. The superstitious horror of water was passed down from generation to generation, and Europe became a great dumping ground. The age of Renaissance and Enlightenment was marked not only by discoveries in science, medicine, and astronomy. It wasn't just beautiful masterpieces of art. It was marked by the stench of city streets, sewage, and waste. But for that, kings poured perfume on themselves, and the stench was unbearable. It was very difficult to get used to the unpleasant odors emanating from unwashed bodies. In the course of disguise in the form of powder and perfume tinctures, the nobles tried to change their clothes as often as possible, but it did not help much. The fashion for layered clothing arose in Europe not because of beauty, but because of the belief that it was necessary to wear several layers of clothing to absorb sweat and foul odors. Clothes were very rarely washed. Only air and dirt stains scrubbed off. The fashion for high hairstyles attached to frames, which emerged in the 18th century, further exacerbated the unsanitary situation. Towers on the head were worn for long periods of time. They were not taken apart, and the hair was not brushed. These bulky structures on the head became a haven not only for insects, but also for mice, which were warm and comfortable. The beginning of the 19th century brought new trends from medics and scientists. They began to educate, talked about body hygiene and cleanliness. Gradually, with great difficulty, Europeans began to understand the necessity of friendship with water. Baths appeared in the homes of the nobles, and the poor people had jugs of water to wash their faces, hands, and bodies. Europe was becoming a civilized country fragrant with perfume, not uncleanness. In those troubled Christian times, taking care of the body was considered a sin. Christian preachers urged people to walk around in rags and never wash, because that was the way to achieve spiritual purification. Washing was not allowed also because it was a way to wash away the holy water that was touched at baptism. As a result, people did not wash for years or did not know water at all. Dirt and lice were considered special signs of holiness. Monks and nuns set an appropriate example of service to the Lord for the rest of the Christians. Not all of them, but only of certain orders. Cleanliness was looked upon with disgust. Lice were called God's pearls and considered a sign of holiness. Saints, both male and female, usually boasted that water never touched their feet, except when they had to wade through rivers. Also not all, but only some orders. P. Krasnov. People were so weaned from water procedures that Dr. Biltz, in a popular medical textbook of the late XIX century, had to persuade people to wash. There are people who, in truth, do not dare to bathe in a river or in a bathtub, for from childhood they have never entered the water. This fear is groundless, wrote Bills in the book New Natural Cure. After the 5th or 6th bath to this can get used to it. Few believe the doctor. Perfume, an important European invention, was born precisely as a reaction to the lack of baths. The original task of the famous French perfumery was one: to mask the terrible stench of years of unwashed bodies with pungent and persistent perfumes. The French Sun King, waking up one morning in a bad mood, and this was his usual state in the morning, because, as we know, Louis XIV suffered from insomnia due to bedbugs, ordered all the courtiers to perfume themselves. This is an edict of Louis XIV, which stated that when visiting the court should not spare strong perfume, so that their aroma drowned out the stench of bodies and clothes. Originally, these odorous mixtures were quite natural. Ladies of the European Middle Ages, knowing about the stimulating effect of natural body odor, smeared their juices as perfume, areas of skin behind the ears, and on the neck to attract the attention of the desired object. With the advent of Christianity, future generations of Europeans forgot about flush toilets for 1,500 years, turning their faces to night vases. The role of the forgotten sewerage system was performed by ditches in the streets, where stinking streams of slop flowed. Forgotten about the ancient benefits of civilization, people now spit where they have to. For example, on the front steps of a palace or castle. The French royal court periodically moved from castle to castle because the old one was literally unbreathable. Night pots stood under beds for days and nights on end. After King Louis IV of France was poured shit out of a window, the citizens of Paris were allowed to dispose of household waste through the window with only 3 preliminary shouts. Beware. Around the 17th century, wide-brimmed hats were invented to protect heads from feces. The original purpose of curtsying was merely to keep the stinky hat away from the sensitive nose of the lady. In the Louvre, the palace of the French kings, there were no toilets. They emptied in the courtyard, on the staircases, on the balconies. When the guests, courtiers, and kings either squatted on the wide windowsill at the open window, or they were brought night vases, the contents of which were then poured out at the back doors of the palace. The same thing happened in Versailles, for example, during the reign of Louis XIV, whose life is well known thanks to the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon. Court ladies of the Versailles Palace, right in the middle of a conversation, and sometimes even during Mass in the chapel or cathedral, stood up and casually so, in a corner, to do a little and not so little need. The French Sun King, like all other kings, allowed his courtiers to use any corners of Versailles and other castles as toilets. The walls of castles were equipped with heavy drapes, and blind niches were made in the corridors. But was it not easier to equip some toilets in the yard, or just run to the park? No, it never even occurred to anyone, because the guardian of tradition was diarrhea / relentless, capable of catching anyone and anywhere by surprise. With the appropriate quality of medieval food, diarrhea was permanent. The same reason can be traced in the fashion of those years for men's pantaloons, consisting of vertical ribbons in several layers. The Parisian fashion for large, wide skirts is obviously due to the same reasons, although skirts were also used for another purpose, to hide the doggy underneath, which was meant to protect the beautiful ladies from fleas. Naturally, pious people preferred to defecate only with God's help. The Hungarian historian István Rathfag, in the Comedy of the Book, cites types of prayers from a prayer book entitled Immodest Wishes of a God-Fearing and Repentant Soul for Every Day and on Various Occasions, which includes prayer when performing natural needs. Medieval cities of Europe, which did not have sewers, but had a fortress wall and a defensive moat filled with water. It played the role of sewerage. Shit was dumped from the walls into the moat. Here is how, according to European archaeologists, looked like a real French night at the turn of the XIV centuries. The average height of this medieval heartbreaker rarely exceeded 1.60 meters, with a little centimeters. The population then generally was stunted. The unshaven and unwashed face of this handsome man was disfigured by smallpox. Almost everyone in Europe had it then. Under the knight's helmet, in the aristocrat's dirty hair, and in the folds of his clothes, lice and fleas were swarming in large numbers. The knight's mouth smelled so strongly that it would be a terrible ordeal for modern ladies not only to kiss him, but even to stand next to him. Alas, no one brushed their teeth back then, and medieval knights ate everything in a row, drinking all this sour beer and snacking on garlic for disinfection. In addition, during the next campaign, the knight was chained for days in lats, which he could not remove without help. The procedure of putting on and taking off the lats took about an hour, and sometimes even longer. Of course, the noble knight used to take all his needs right into his armor. It was not always so. During the transition usually wore chainmail. Solid lats were usually put on before the battle. It was too heavy in them. Some historians have wondered why Salah ad-Din's soldiers found Christian camps so easily. The answer came very soon: by smell. If at the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe, one of the main foodstuffs were acorns, which were eaten not only by commoners, but also by the nobility, then later, in those rare years when there was no famine, the table was more diverse. Fancy and expensive spices were not only used to show wealth, they also blocked the odor exuded by meat and other foods. In Spain in the Middle Ages, women often rubbed garlic on their hair to prevent lice. To look pale and dark, ladies drank vinegar. Dogs, in addition to working as live flea traps, one more way to help ladies' beauty. In the Middle Ages, dog urine was used to bleach hair.